An elderly woman, abandoned by her own children and left with nothing but a forgotten, crumbling farm, makes one final desperate choice to start over where no one else would. But hidden beneath that broken land lies a secret her father protected for decades, a discovery that will transform her life in ways no one could have imagined. Subscribe for more powerful stories and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Eleanor Whitmore was 72 when the silence in her life became unbearable. After 55 years of marriage, her husband, Arthur, passed away quietly in their suburban Chicago home, leaving behind memories and a family that wasted no time dividing what he left behind. Within weeks, her son Daniel and daughter Melissa had taken control of everything: the house, the savings, even the car Eleanor had driven for over a decade. They spoke in calm, calculated tones, calling it planning, efficiency, what's best for you. But Eleanor felt it for what it truly was: erasure. By the time they were done, there was only one thing left untouched: a decaying ranch in rural Montana that had belonged to her father, Walter Hayes. The place was dismissed as worthless, too remote, too broken, too expensive to fix. So they gave it to her. Eleanor didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply nodded, packed a single suitcase, and disappeared from their neatly controlled world. Because what her children didn't know was that her father had always guarded that land like a secret, and Eleanor had spent her entire life wondering why. Now, with nothing left to lose, she was finally going to find out. Eleanor arrived in Montana with $52 in her wallet, a fading photograph of her parents, and a quiet determination that surprised even her. The bus dropped her off at a lonely roadside station just before sunset. The air was colder than she expected, biting through her thin coat as she stood there, staring at the endless stretch of land ahead. No one came to greet her. No one even knew she was coming. The ranch sat nearly 5 miles away, tucked behind a winding dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Eleanor walked the entire distance, dragging her suitcase through gravel and dust, each step heavier than the last. By the time she reached the property, the sky had turned a deep violet, and the first stars were beginning to appear. She stopped at the edge of the land. "This is it," she whispered. The house looked worse than she remembered: paint stripped down to bare wood, windows cracked, the porch leaning like it might collapse at any moment. The barn stood behind it, half swallowed by weeds, its roof sagging under years of neglect. This was what her children had left her with: a ruin. But as Eleanor stepped forward, something stirred deep inside her. Not despair, not regret. Something else, something older. Memory. Her father, Walter Hayes, had never been a man of many words, but he had been protective, almost obsessively so, about this land. He never let anyone inside the barn, not neighbors, not workers, not even Eleanor when she was a child. "There's nothing in there for you," he used to say, but his tone had always suggested otherwise. Eleanor pushed open the front door. It creaked loudly, echoing through the empty house like a warning. Dust coated every surface. The air smelled stale, untouched for decades. She set her suitcase down in the hallway and stood still for a long moment. 72 years old, no income, no family support, no safety net. Just this broken house, and a question that had followed her for half a century. Why had her father protected this place so fiercely? That night, Eleanor didn't sleep much. She lay on an old mattress she found upstairs, wrapped in a worn quilt that still carried a faint scent of cedar. The silence was overwhelming. No traffic, no voices, no television humming in the background, just the wind brushing against the walls and the occasional creak of aging wood. But instead of fear, she felt something unexpected: peace. The next morning, she woke before sunrise. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the reality returned, but this time, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like a beginning. She got up and started working. Day 1, she cleared the living room. Day 2, the kitchen. Day 3, the bedrooms. Her hands blistered, her back ached, but she didn't stop. Every piece of debris she carried outside, every layer of dust she wiped away, it felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from her. On the 4th day, a pickup truck pulled into the driveway. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with weathered hands and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You planning on living here?" he asked, leaning against his truck. Eleanor straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "I already am." He studied her for a moment, clearly skeptical. "You'll need water, power too. Both got shut off years ago." "I'll figure it out." The man nodded slowly, as if testing her resolve. "Name's Carter Blake. I've got a place down the road." "Eleanor Whitmore." He glanced toward the barn. "That thing's been locked up longer than I can remember." Eleanor followed his gaze. Her heartbeat quickened slightly. "I noticed—" Carter hesitated, then added, "Your father didn't let anyone near it, not once." "I remember." Silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Then Carter pushed himself off the truck. "If you're serious about staying, you're gonna need help." "I don't have money to pay you." He shrugged. "Didn't ask for any." Eleanor looked at him carefully. In another life, she might have said no. Pride, caution, habit, they would have stopped her. But that life was gone. "All right," she said quietly. And just like that, something shifted. Over the next few days, Carter helped her get the basics: running water, electricity, a temporary fix for the roof. He didn't ask questions. He didn't pry. He just showed up and worked. And Eleanor watched him, the same way she used to watch her father. Quiet, focused, intentional. On the 8th morning, Eleanor stood at the edge of the barn, a rusted hammer in her hand. The lock hung there, worn by time but still intact, like it had been waiting. Her father's voice echoed faintly in her memory. "There's nothing in there for you." Eleanor tightened her grip on the hammer. "I think you were wrong about that," she murmured. Then, with one decisive swing, she broke the lock. The sound of metal snapping echoed louder than Eleanor expected. The rusted lock hit the ground with a dull thud, stirring dust that had likely been undisturbed for decades. For a moment, she didn't move. Her hand still gripped the hammer, her breath shallow, her heart pounding harder than it had in years. This wasn't just a door. It was a boundary her father had never allowed her to cross. Slowly, she reached forward and pulled the barn door open. It groaned in protest, the hinges shrieking as sunlight cut through the darkness inside. The beam of light revealed chaos-collapsed beams, rotting hay, rusted tools hanging like forgotten relics of another life. At first glance, it looked exactly like what her children had assumed. Worthless. Eleanor stepped inside carefully, testing each step as the wooden floor creaked beneath her weight. Dust swirled in the air, illuminated by the thin rays of light breaking through holes in the roof. But then she noticed it. The ground beneath her feet didn't feel right. She frowned and tapped it lightly with the hammer. A dull, solid echo responded. Concrete. Her pulse quickened. "That doesn't belong here," she whispered. Barns didn't have concrete floors, not like this. Not smooth, not uniform, not poured wall to wall like a foundation meant to hide something. She crouched down, brushing aside layers of dirt and hay. The surface beneath was clean, too clean for a place that had been abandoned for decades. Her instincts sharpened. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Eleanor stood and began walking slowly across the barn, tapping the ground as she went. Each strike of the hammer produced the same solid sound until she reached the far corner. There, the echo changed. Hollow. She froze. Tapped again. Hollow. A different tone, a deeper resonance. Her breath caught in her throat as realization crept in. There's something under here. She dropped to her knees, pressing her ear against the cold surface. And she heard it. A faint, empty echo, like a hidden space beneath the floor. Eleanor leaned back slowly, staring at the ground as if it might suddenly reveal its secrets on its own. Her father hadn't just protected this barn. He had built something inside it, or beneath it. Her mind raced. Questions flooded in faster than she could process them. What had he been hiding? Why go through this much effort? Why never tell anyone? And more importantly, why leave it to her? Eleanor reached into her coat pocket, her fingers instinctively finding the old brass pocket watch her father had given her before he died. She had carried it for over 20 years, never understanding why it mattered. Now it felt heavier, Important. She turned it over in her hand, her eyes locking onto the 4 engraved numbers on the back. Not a date. Not a year. A code? Her heart skipped. No, she whispered, shaking her head slightly. It can't be that simple. But deep down, she knew. Her father had never done anything without reason. Eleanor stood up slowly, her gaze returning to the section of concrete beneath her feet. She couldn't break through this alone, not with a hammer, not at her age. Frustration flickered, but it didn't last long. Because now, she had something stronger than frustration. Purpose! She turned and walked out of the barn, closing the door behind her as if sealing the secret back inside. Carter was already outside, leaning against his truck, watching her with quiet curiosity. Well, he asked. Eleanor met his eyes. For a brief moment, she considered lying, saying it was nothing, saying the barn was exactly what it looked like. But something about Carter, the way he showed up without asking, the way he worked without expectation, told her he wasn't someone who needed lies. There's concrete under the floor, she said. Carter's expression shifted instantly. In a barn. Yes. He straightened. That's not normal. I know. Silence hung between them, heavier now. Then Eleanor added, her voice lower, more certain. And part of it sounds hollow. Carter stared at her for a long second. Then he let out a slow breath. You think there's something under it? I don't think, she replied quietly. I know. A flicker of something crossed his face, interest, maybe even excitement, but it was quickly replaced by caution. You planning to dig it up? Eleanor held up the hammer slightly, a faint knowing smile touching her lips. Carter huffed out a short laugh. That would have taken you a week, and probably a trip to the hospital. Then I suppose I need a better plan. He studied her again, more seriously this time. You trust me. The question caught her off guard. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Trust wasn't something she gave easily anymore, not after everything that had happened. But then she thought about her children, about how easily they had taken everything, about how quickly they had justified it. And then she thought about Carter, the man who had shown up, stayed, helped, asked for nothing. She met his gaze. I trust what you've shown me, she said. That was enough. Carter nodded once. I've got a jackhammer. Eleanor's breath caught slightly. Will it break through? He gave a small, confident smirk. Only one way to find out. Eleanor looked back toward the barn, toward the hidden space beneath it, toward the truth her father had buried for decades. And for the first time since arriving, she felt it clearly. Everything was about to change. The next morning arrived colder than usual. A thin fog clung to the ground, wrapping the barn in a quiet, almost sacred stillness. Eleanor stood just outside the door, her hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, watching as Carter unloaded the jackhammer from his truck. The machine looked heavy, industrial, far more serious than anything she had imagined using. This is your last chance to change your mind, Carter said, glancing at her. Eleanor didn't hesitate. I've spent 50 years wondering what my father was hiding. She replied, I'm not stopping now. Carter nodded once. That was all he needed. Inside the barn, the air filled quickly with the roar of the compressor. The noise was deafening, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through Eleanor's chest. She stepped back, covering her ears as Carter positioned the jackhammer over the hollow section she had found. Then he pulled the trigger. The machine slammed into the concrete with violent force. Chunks began to crack. Dust exploded into the air. Time blurred. Minutes stretched into something heavier, something charged with anticipation. Eleanor stood there, barely breathing, watching as layer after layer of concrete broke apart. And then, a sharp metallic sound cut through the chaos. Carter stopped immediately. Silence rushed in, thick and overwhelming. They both stared at the ground. Slowly, Carter knelt and brushed away the debris with his gloved hands. Steel, a solid, flat surface hidden beneath the concrete. Eleanor stepped closer, her pulse racing uncontrollably now. It's a hatch, Carter said quietly. Not just any hatch. Heavy duty, reinforced, designed to last. The kind of thing you didn't install unless you had something very important to protect. or hide. They cleared more of the broken concrete, revealing the full shape roughly 4 feet wide, perfectly embedded into a steel frame. On one side, a thick latch secured it shut, and attached to that latch, a combination lock. Eleanor's breath caught. Her hand instinctively moved to her coat pocket. The watch. She pulled it out slowly, her fingers trembling not with fear, but with something deeper. Recognition. "This is it," she whispered. Carter looked at her. "You know the code." Eleanor turned the watch over, staring at the 4 engraved numbers that had meant nothing for decades. Until now. "I think my father gave it to me," she said. The air between them tightened. Every second felt heavier than the last as Eleanor knelt beside the lock. Her hands shook slightly as she reached forward and began to turn the dial. Left, right, left, right. Each number clicked into place with a quiet precision that sent chills down her spine. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, click! The sound was soft, but it echoed like thunder in Eleanor's chest. She froze. Carter let out a slow breath. "You did it." Eleanor stared at the lock, her mind struggling to catch up with reality. All those years, all those questions, and the answer had been in her hands the entire time. "My father," she whispered. "He trusted you," Carter said. Eleanor swallowed hard, emotions rising unexpectedly. Not grief, not anger. Understanding. For the first time in her life, she realized something that changed everything. Her father hadn't been distant because he didn't care. He had been distant because he was protecting something. Something so important, so dangerous, that even telling her the truth could have put her at risk. All those years, she had believed he chose the barn over her. But now, she saw the truth. He had chosen her. Every single day, Eleanor placed her hand on the cold steel surface of the hatch. It felt solid, real. A lifetime of silence sitting just beneath her fingertips. Carter stepped closer. "You want me to open it?" Eleanor shook her head immediately. "No." Her voice was calm now, certain. "This was meant for me." She gripped the handle. It was heavier than she expected. The metal groaned slightly as she pulled, resisting at first like it hadn't been opened in decades. Then, slowly, it gave way. A rush of cold air rose from below. Not stale, not rotten. Controlled, preserved. Eleanor leaned forward, peering into the darkness beneath. A steel ladder disappeared into the shadows. She took a flashlight from Carter without looking away. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. Eleanor paused. Then, without turning back, she replied, "I'm not alone." She placed her foot on the first rung and began to descend. Each step echoed softly as she moved deeper into the unknown. The light from above faded. The air grew cooler, stiller, heavier, until finally, her feet touched solid ground. Eleanor raised the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, and what it revealed stopped her heart. Rows, endless rows, shelves stretching across a massive underground vault, filled with thousands of glass bottles, perfectly preserved, sealed, labeled, waiting. Eleanor's breath left her in a whisper. Oh my God. In that moment, everything she thought she knew about her father, about her past, about her life, shattered, and something entirely new began to take its place. Eleanor stood frozen in the center of the underground vault, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. The silence was overwhelming. Thousands of glass bottles surrounded her, perfectly aligned, coated in a thin layer of dust but otherwise untouched by time, each one sealed with wax, each one labeled in careful handwriting. Her father's handwriting. She stepped forward slowly, almost afraid the scene might disappear if she moved too quickly. Her fingers reached out, brushing against one of the bottles. The glass was cool, solid, real. She lifted it carefully. Hayes Reserve, 1956, barrel 12, bottle 87. Eleanor stared at the label, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was holding. This is whiskey, Carter said from behind her. his voice low with disbelief as he climbed down into the vault. "Not just whiskey," Eleanor whispered. Even without knowing the market, she could feel it. This wasn't ordinary. This was aged, preserved, intentional. "This is a lifetime." Carter walked past her, scanning the endless shelves. "This is more than a lifetime," he said quietly. "This is a legacy." Eleanor turned slowly, taking it all in again, row after row, year after year. Her father hadn't just made whiskey. He had built something extraordinary, and then hidden it from the world. Why didn't he sell it, she asked, more to herself than to Carter. There was only one place left to look for answers. Near the ladder, tucked neatly on a workbench untouched by decay. She saw it. An envelope? Her name written across the front. "Eleanor?" Her chest tightened as she picked it up. The paper was aged but perfectly preserved, sealed with wax that cracked softly under her fingers as she opened it. She unfolded the letter and began to read. Minutes passed in silence. Carter didn't interrupt. He didn't move. He simply stood there, watching as Eleanor's expression slowly changed shock, confusion, and then something deeper. Understanding. When she finally lowered the letter, her hands were steady. "He was protecting it," she said quietly. "From what Carter asked." Eleanor looked at him. "From people?" She took a slow breath. "My father built this during a time when what he was doing wasn't exactly legal. He trusted the wrong person once, and it nearly cost him everything." Carter nodded slightly, "So he buried it." "He sealed it away," Eleanor corrected softly, "and he waited." "For what?" Eleanor's eyes softened as she looked down at the letter again. "For me." The weight of that realization settled deep in her chest. All those years, all those moments she thought he had chosen work over her. He had been building something for her future, something no one else could take, something no one else even knew existed. Eleanor turned slowly, looking back at the shelves. "This isn't just money," she said. "This is trust." Carter crossed his arms, studying her. "It's also worth something. A lot. I'd imagine." Eleanor nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "And that changes things." For the first time since arriving at the farm, her thoughts shifted not toward survival, but toward possibility. She wasn't trapped here anymore. She wasn't abandoned. She wasn't powerless. She was standing on something far greater than she had ever imagined. But with that realization came something else. Responsibility. Eleanor carefully placed the bottle back on the shelf. "If this is as valuable as it looks," she said, "then I can't rush this." Carter gave a small approving nod. "Smart. I need to know exactly what this is worth," she continued. "Not guess, not assume. You'll need an expert." "I know. And someone you trust." Eleanor glanced at him briefly. "That list is short." Carter smirked slightly. "Good. Keeps things simple." They climbed back up into the barn together, sealing the hatch carefully behind them. The sunlight felt almost unreal after the darkness below. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, staring at the ground that now held a completely different meaning. Just days ago, this place had been a burden. A discarded piece of land no one wanted. Now, it was the center of everything. "What's your next move?" Carter asked. Eleanor took a deep breath. "I go to town," she said. "And do what?" "I find out exactly what my father left me." Her voice was calm, focused, but beneath it, something stronger was building. Confidence. Not the kind that comes from comfort, but the kind that comes from surviving loss and discovering power in its place. Eleanor turned toward the house, then paused. "And Carter?" "Yeah. Thank you." He shrugged lightly. "You haven't seen the hard part yet." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I think I'm ready for it." As she walked back toward the house, something inside her had already changed. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about what she had lost. She was thinking about what she could build. The drive into town felt different this time. Eleanor sat behind the wheel of Carter's old pickup, her hands steady on the steering wheel, her eyes focused on the road ahead. Just weeks ago, she had arrived here as someone displaced, fragile, uncertain, carrying the weight of betrayal. Now, she was someone else entirely. Not because of the money, but because of what she had discovered within herself. The small-town library was quiet when she stepped inside. The scent of old books and polished wood wrapped around her like something familiar. Eleanor approached the front desk, where a woman with silver hair and reading glasses looked up with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Eleanor said calmly. "I need information on vintage whiskey, pricing, auctions, collectors. Anything you have?" The librarian blinked, slightly surprised, but nodded. "For personal interest." Eleanor paused for a fraction of a second. Then she answered honestly, "For something I own." Hours passed. Eleanor read everything she could find: articles, auction records, collector reports. She took notes carefully, her teacher's instincts returning as naturally as breathing. Patterns began to form. Older bottles, limited batches, proper storage, provenance, value. By the time she leaned back in her chair, her understanding had shifted from curiosity to clarity. "This could be worth millions," she whispered. But instead of panic, she felt control, because she wasn't guessing anymore. She was learning. That afternoon, Carter drove her to meet a spirits appraiser in the nearest city, a man named Victor Langston. His office was sleek, modern, filled with glass cases displaying rare bottles worth more than most cars. Victor greeted them with professional courtesy, but the moment he stepped into the barn later that day and descended into the vault, everything changed. He didn't speak for a long time. He walked slowly between the shelves, lifting bottles, examining seals, reading labels. His movements became more careful with each step, his expression tightening with disbelief. Finally, he turned to Eleanor. "Where did you get this?" "My father," she replied simply. Victor exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't just rare," he said. "This is extraordinary." "How much?" Eleanor asked. Victor hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because he understood the weight of what he was about to say. "Based on what I've seen," he began carefully, "you're looking at a collection worth somewhere between $20 and $30 million. The number hung in the air. Carter shifted slightly behind her. But Eleanor didn't react the way most people would. No gasp, no shock, no sudden excitement. Just stillness. Because in that moment, she realized something important. The number didn't define her. It didn't change who she was. It simply gave her options. "What would you recommend?" she asked calmly. Victor studied her, clearly reassessing the woman in front of him. "Slow release," he said. "Small batches, private collectors, auctions. If you flood the market, you lose value, but if you control the supply—" "I control the outcome," Eleanor finished. Victor smiled slightly. "Exactly." On the drive back, Carter finally broke the silence. "You just found out you're sitting on a fortune," he said, "and you didn't even blink." Eleanor looked out the window at the passing fields. "I've already lost everything once," she replied quietly. "That changes how you see things." Carter nodded. "Fair enough." Over the next few weeks, Eleanor began rebuilding not just the farm, but her entire life. She paid off the property taxes, repaired the house, bought her own truck, opened a bank account under her name, only her name. Every decision she made was deliberate, documented, controlled. No one guided her. No one approved her choices. For the first time in decades, she answered only to herself. But the biggest change wasn't financial. It was internal. Eleanor no longer saw herself as a victim of what her children had done. She saw herself as someone who had survived it, who had adapted, who had rebuilt from nothing. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Eleanor sat on the newly repaired porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands. Carter leaned against the railing nearby, watching the sky shift into shades of orange and gold. "You ever think about telling them?" he asked. Eleanor didn't need to ask who he meant. "My children." "Yeah." She was quiet for a long moment. "They made their choice," she said finally. "And now you're making yours." Eleanor nodded. "I'm not hiding this," she continued, "but I'm not offering it either." Carter smiled faintly. "That's a different kind of strength." Eleanor looked out at the land, the fields, the barn, the house that no longer felt broken. "I used to think strength meant holding everything together," she said softly. "And now Now I think it means knowing what to let go of. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the quiet rhythm of a life that no longer needed approval to exist. Eleanor Whitmore had lost everything, and in doing so, she had finally found herself. Spring arrived quietly, but everything about Eleanor's life had changed. The farmhouse no longer looked abandoned. Fresh white paint reflected the sunlight. The porch stood strong with new cedar planks, and the once overgrown driveway had been cleared and lined with gravel. The land itself seemed to breathe again, green stretching across the fields where decay had once ruled. Eleanor stood on the porch one morning, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the property that had once been dismissed as worthless. Now it was everything, but not because of what lay beneath it, because of what she had built above it. The whiskey sales had begun carefully, just as Victor advised. Small batches, private collectors, quiet transactions that brought in more money than Eleanor had ever imagined handling in her lifetime. But the money was never the point. It was what she chose to do with it that defined her. A few miles outside of town, an old storefront that had been empty for years now carried a simple sign. Hayes Community Aid. Eleanor unlocked the door every morning at 8 a.m. sharp. Inside, the space was modest but warm tables, chairs, a small office, and a coffee station that never went empty. People started coming. At first, just a few. An elderly man whose son had forced him out of his home, a widow drowning in paperwork she didn't understand, a retired veteran who couldn't access the benefits he had earned. Eleanor didn't pretend to have all the answers, but she knew how to listen. And more importantly, she knew what it felt like to lose everything. So she built a system. She hired a part-time attorney, connected with a social worker, partnered with local services. And slowly, she created something powerful. A place where people weren't ignored, a place where they weren't dismissed, a place where someone finally said, "I believe you." One afternoon, Carter leaned against the doorway, watching Eleanor speak with an older woman whose hands trembled as she explained her situation. "You've done something incredible here," he said later. Eleanor shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "I just used what I was given, the right way." Carter studied her for a moment. "Most people wouldn't." Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's because most people are still trying to prove something, and you're not." She looked around the room, the people, the conversations, the quiet sense of purpose filling the space. "No," she said softly. "I already know who I am." Months passed. The farm continued to thrive. The business grew steadily. The community center became a lifeline for people who had nowhere else to turn. And Eleanor, she found something she never expected at 72 years old. Peace. Not the kind that comes from comfort, but the kind that comes from clarity. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the fields, Eleanor sat on the porch beside Carter. The air was warm, filled with the soft hum of insects and the distant rustling of trees. "You ever think about how close you came to losing all of this?" Carter asked. Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I didn't almost lose this," she said. "I had to lose everything else to find it." Carter nodded slowly. "That's one way to look at it." Eleanor glanced toward the barn, the same structure that had once held only questions, and now held answers that had reshaped her entire life. "My father spent his life protecting something," she said. And now Carter asked, "Now I understand why." Silence settled between them, comfortable and steady. Then, in the distance, headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. Eleanor noticed immediately. A car slowly approached, unfamiliar, but not unexpected. Carter followed her gaze. "You expecting someone?" Eleanor stood up slowly, setting her coffee aside. "Maybe," she said. The car came to a stop. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, hesitant, uncertain, but determined enough to be there. Melissa, Eleanor's daughter. For a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them wasn't just physical. It was built from choices, from silence, from regret. Melissa walked forward slowly, stopping at the edge of the porch. "Mom," she said softly. Eleanor looked at her not with anger, not with resentment, but with something far more powerful. "Clarity." "You came back," Eleanor said. Melissa nodded, her voice breaking slightly. "I didn't come for anything," she said quickly. I needed to see you." Eleanor studied her for a long moment. Then she stepped forward. "Good," she said gently. "Because that's the only reason that matters." And in that moment, standing on the porch of a life she had rebuilt from nothing, Eleanor realized something profound. She hadn't just uncovered her father's secret. She had uncovered her own strength. And no one would ever take that from her again. Eleanor Whitmore didn't just uncover a hidden fortune beneath an abandoned ranch. She uncovered a truth most people spend their entire lives avoiding, that everything easily taken from you was never truly yours to begin with. Her children took the house, the money, the comfort. They believed those things defined security, power, and control. But when all of that was stripped away, Eleanor discovered something far more valuable: her resilience. Her father understood this long before she did. That's why he didn't leave his legacy in bank accounts or visible wealth. He buried it, protected it, and trusted that only someone strong enough, patient enough, would find it and use it wisely. Eleanor became that person. Not because she was the youngest, not because she was the strongest, but because she was the one who stayed, the one who endured, the one who didn't give up when everything else was gone. And in the end, that made her the only one worthy of what was left behind. If this story made you reflect on your own life, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Stories like this remind us that it's never too late to start over, and sometimes, the greatest comeback begins when you have nothing left to lose.